Okay, well, good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all virtually to the first BSS event for the 2021-2022 season. I'd like to start by just saying a couple of words. For those who don't know me, my name is Megan Jendryzik. I'm the Vice President of the MIT Club of Boston, in charge of running the MIT Boston Seminar Series. Graduated from MIT in 1997 with a degree in biology, and I'm glad to be back in the Boston area, which is home for me. For those who aren't familiar with the Club of Boston, we have a variety of events throughout the year, ranging from the pure entertainment side of things with getting group tickets to Broadway on Boston, to more educational oriented events like this one. We also have a book club. We have a fine spirits and food tasting series, and we're also starting to do more tours of facilities, labs, and museums in the area. And so now tonight, it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Alan Lightman. He's one of the rare people who can straddle both the worlds of the sciences and the humanities very successfully. He was, in fact, his science background is in physics. He has a BA from a bachelor's degree in physics from Princeton, his magna cum laude, and a PhD in theoretical physics from the California Institute of Technology. He's received, on top of that, 5 honorary degrees. Did a postdoctoral fellowship in astrophysics at Cornell, during which time he began publishing poetry in small literary magazines. Was an assistant professor of astronomy at Harvard for a few years, and then a research scientist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. He joined MIT faculty in 1989, appointed professor of science and writing, and senior lecturer in physics. And he headed the program in writing and humanistic studies from 1991 to 1997, and was instrumental in creating a new communication requirement at MIT, which has been a great value to many of our faculty and students in communicating the relevancy and value of their work. The author of many books, Einstein's Dreams, Good Benito, of course, and most recently the first ever MIT Press children's book, Ada and the Galaxies. And tonight he is going to share with us from his thoughts from his book, Looking for Stars on an Island in Maine. And so with that, I will gladly turn the podium virtually over to you, Professor Lightman.
Thank you, Megan. It's an honor to be asked to talk to you tonight. I was at MIT just a couple of days ago, which is my first trip to the campus in a year and a half. And besides getting a year and a half's worth of mail, I was really delighted and impressed by how effective the COVID protocols are at MIT. Just another example of how efficient and effective our beloved institute is. For many years, my wife and I have spent our summers on an island in Maine. It's a small island, only about 30 acres in size, and there aren't any bridges or ferries connecting it to the mainland. And so each of the 6 families who live on the island has their own boat. My story concerns a particular summer night late in the wee hours when I was out in my boat coming home to the island. And I just rounded the south end of the island and was carefully motoring towards my dock. There was nobody out on the water except me. It was a moonless night and quiet. And the stars vibrated, the sky vibrated with stars, one of those spectacular starry nights. So taking a chance, I turned off the running lights of my boat and it got even darker. And then I turned off the engine. I lay down in the boat and looked up. A very dark night sky seen from the ocean is really a mystical experience. After a few minutes, my world had dissolved into that star-littered sky. The boat disappeared, my body disappeared, and I found myself falling into infinity. I felt an overwhelming connection to the stars, if I were part of them. And the vast expanse of time extending from the far distant past, long before I was born, into the far distant future, long after I would die, all of that seemed compressed to a dot. I felt connected not only to the stars, but to all of nature. Something far larger than myself. After a time, I sat up and started the engine again. Well, I've worked as a physicist for many years, and I've always had a purely scientific view of the world. And by that, I mean that the universe is made of material and nothing more, that the universe is governed exclusively by a small number of fundamental forces and laws, and that all of the composite things in the world eventually disintegrate. And even at the age of 12 or 13, I was impressed by the logic and materiality of the world. When I was a teenager, I built my own laboratory, and I imagine many of you did the same things when you were young. And among other projects, I made pendulums by tying little weights to the end of a string. And if I can show you what I'm talking about here. So this is what I'm talking about. I made pendulums like this. I'd read in popular science that the time to make a pendulum, for the pendulum to make a complete swing, was proportional to the square root of the length of the string. So with the help of a stopwatch and a ruler, I've verified this wonderful law. Logic and pattern, cause and effect. As far as I could tell, everything was subject to analysis and quantitative tests. Everything could be measured and described by numbers. I saw no reason to believe in the non-material. I saw no reason to believe in anything that couldn't be proved. Forgive my clumsiness here. Yet, after my experience in that boat many years later, I understood the powerful allure of the ethereal, of feelings that are not necessarily provable, and experiences that are not reducible to logical analysis. And at the same time, and perhaps paradoxically, I remain a scientist. I remain committed to the material world. For thousands of years, we human beings have been torn between material and the immaterial. Modern science, of course, has shown us that all things in the material world are impermanent and ultimately pass away. Atoms, once thought to be indivisible and indestructible, can be split, as all of you know. Stars, once thought to be eternal and even divine, eventually use up their nuclear fuel and burn out, as you know. Even our entire universe, once thought to be the ultimate and largest unity possible, is considered by some physicists to be only one of a vast number of universes called the multiverse, many of which don't have the right conditions for life. And yet, we long for something that is eternal. Part of us wants to reduce everything to atoms and molecules, which are governed by logic and laws. And part of us wants to resist that temptation, wants to believe that some things defy that kind of reduction. This tension between the material and the ethereal has been the source of our science on one hand, and our religion, art, and spirituality on the other. This tension comes into the discussion of free will versus determinism, the understanding of consciousness, questions of ethics and moral behavior, discussions of art and aesthetics, and it even is related to the definition and boundaries of science and what constitutes faith. For me, the human body is the most amazing and baffling phenomena of the material world. Some years ago, I had a colonoscopy without being fully anesthetized, and it was able to watch on a computer the shifting screens of the insides of my colon. I was dismayed because there, revealed in digital detail, was the deep interior of my body, a realm I'd always considered as mysterious, a forbidden temple, fragile and secretive as it went about its profound business of keeping me alive. Surely that mystical place was separate from the world of tables and chairs and gratefully hidden from the gaze of my eyes. But there it was on the screen with no illusions. I was shocked to see ordinary flesh. I was shocked to see gelatinous membranes like quivering jelly, whitish in color, with bumps and ridges and turns. I felt like a trespasser in my own body. My colon was just material stuff. And I am just material stuff, or so I believe. I know this intellectually, but I recoil from the idea. In recent years, I've gotten to know a prominent Buddhist monk in Cambodia. I make a lot of trips to Cambodia each year for a nonprofit that I work with. And this monk's name is Yos Hoot Kemakero. His friends just call him Kema. After the devastation of the Khmer Rouge genocide in the 1970s, Kema played a major role in rebuilding the Buddhist monkhood in Cambodia. So I visited Kema one warm day in January at Wat Lich, it's a few years ago, Wat Lich, which is his monastery on a busy avenue in Phnom Penh. I was hoping that he might help me fathom my communion with the stars that summer night in Maine and other experiences that I hadn't completely understood. So I'd like to show you a picture here of Wat Lich. So there it is. It's very beautiful. It's a large temple complex containing several pagodas, patios, and walkways, and living quarters for some 200 monks. There's a magnificent front gate, which you can't see in this picture, which rises 40 feet high and is guarded by stone lions on both sides. As soon as you step through that arched gate, however, you leave behind the steady drone of motos and the shouting of street sellers, and you enter a realm of serenity. Slowly, I walk past the gold leaf pagodas. I pass stone stupas and scattered stone pots filled with red and pink bougainvillea. I passed through courtyards with young men in orange robes, quietly strolling in pairs. Eventually, I came to Kimma's living quarters, which was just a tiny house at the back end of the complex. We sat under some trees. There was a faint scent of jasmine in the air. And under the trees, Kimma and I began discussing modern physics and cosmology. He told me Buddhism is in complete agreement with science. And then he smiled and he added, science just puts in more details. Kimma explained to me the Buddhist belief that the universe has gone through an infinite number of cycles in the past and will go through an infinite number of cycles in the future. When I mentioned to him that modern cosmologists have evidence that the universe will continue expanding forever without further cycles, he laughed. Perhaps he thought it was preposterous that science could know such a thing, or perhaps he thought it was delightful that science could know such a thing. I asked Kimma how Buddhists know that the universe has already gone through an infinite number of cycles. He said that that knowledge comes from the Buddha, one of whose names is the Lakavidu, the knower of worlds. The Buddha knew everything, said Kimma. He took out a pen and scribbled down some books that I should read. And I thought to myself, how do we know that the Buddha was the knower of worlds? Were Einstein and Darwin also knowers of worlds? The truths and the laws that we believe about the physical and spiritual worlds, why do we believe them? And on what authority? Science and religion differ profoundly in the way that truths are discovered. In religion and theology, these truths and beliefs seem to have two origins. First, there are the sacred books, such as the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, the Bardo, Stodal. Believers have faith that these books contain the true word of God or of other special enlightened beings. And if so, the authority of the teachings derives from the infinite wisdom associated with those beings. I respect the notions of God and other divine beings. However, I do insist on one thing. I insist that any statements made about the material world, including statements recorded in the sacred books, must be subject to the experimental testing of science. In my view, the truth of such statements cannot be assumed. They have to be tested and revised or rejected as needed. The spiritual world has its own domain, but the physical world should be the province of science. And in the physical world, the laws of science can't apply to some phenomena, but not to others, or apply at some times, but not at others. It's not okay with me if the principles of aerodynamics work on some of my airplane flights, but not on others. The second origin of religious truth and knowledge is more personal. It's what one might call the transcendent experience. Experiences like the one I had looking up at the stars in Maine. The transcendent experience may or may not involve a supreme being who created the universe. Unlike the received wisdom acquired from the sacred books or the pronouncements of religious institutions, the transcendent experience is intensely personal. And the authority of that experience and the understandings gained from it rest in the experience itself. No other person can deny the validity of what you have felt. The feelings cannot be disproved. Every transcendent experience is a unique event, and it can't necessarily be repeated as in a laboratory experiment. Now, let me move on to scientific knowledge. And what I'm going to be saying, all of you know very well, being graduates and friends of MIT, but I'm going to outline them anyway. I think there are two types of knowledge in science. There's knowledge of the properties of physical objects, like the size and mass of a raindrop. And there's knowledge of what we call the laws of nature. One of the first human beings to formulate a law of the physical world, a law of nature, was Archimedes, more than 2,000 years ago. Archimedes had proposed something he called the law of floating bodies. As I said, this was over 2,000 years ago. And here's what it says. Any solid lighter than a fluid will, if placed in the fluid, be so far immersed in the fluid that the weight of the solid will be equal to the weight of the fluid displaced. Now, we can speculate on how Archimedes arrived at this law. At the time, balance scales were available for weighing goods in the market. The scientist could have first weighed an object, then placed it in a rectangular container of water and measured the rise in height of the water. The area of the container multiplied by the height of the rise would give the volume of water displaced. Then he could take that volume of water and put it in another container and weigh it. Undoubtedly, Archimedes would have performed this exercise many times with different objects before devising the law, and he probably would have performed the experiment with other liquids like mercury to discover the generality of the law. All the laws of the physical world are like Archimedes' laws. They're precise, they're quantitative, and they're general, applying to a large range of phenomena. Most importantly, all the laws of nature discovered by scientists are considered provisional. They're considered to be approximations to deeper laws. They're constantly being revised as new experimental evidence is found or new and testable ideas are proposed. Newton's theory of gravity worked beautifully for 2 centuries until it was discovered the orbit of the planet Mercury differed very, very slightly from what was predicted by Newton's theory, a discrepancy of only about 1/100th of 1 degree every century in the orbit of Mercury. Einstein's theory of gravity replaced Newton's theory. And in fact, we know that Einstein's theory is slightly wrong also because it does not include the effects of quantum mechanics. So it too will eventually be replaced. Still, the approximate knowledge of science has been good enough to give us antibiotics and smartphones. Some scientists, like the late Steven Weinberg, believe that there will be an ultimate theory of nature that needs no further revisions. But of course, we'll never know whether we actually possess that theory because we'll never know whether an experiment the next day could violate the theory. But it's in the process of revision that we see the strongest differences between the methods of science and religion, the methods and beliefs of science and religion, I should say. As I've said, everything that we know about the physical world, the domain of science, has to be tested and revised if necessary. But the knowledge of religion coming from either the divine authority of the sacred books or from the personal transcendent experience is not subject to revision. It is not an approximation. The wisdom of God is absolute. The transcendent experience, the feeling that you have looking up at the stars, that's not an approximation. That's a full experience. And it's considered to be absolutely certain. Well, I mentioned Maine at the beginning of the talk, where my wife and I spend our summers. And one year, a psychiatrist friend of mine thinking that I had nothing to do during my long summers in Maine, he kindly gave me a thick book titled Existential Psychotherapy by Irvin Yalom, emeritus professor of psychiatry at Stanford. Irvin is now 90 years old, still alive and kicking. He's an acolyte of the Gestalt field of psychology. The members of the Gestalt area of psychology believe that we naturally and unavoidably tend to organize all experience into meaningful patterns. For example, when we look at a pattern of random dots, when we look at a picture of random dots, we parse it into figures and background. And when we see a broken circle, we mentally complete the circle. That's sort of what I mean when I talk about our tendency to always form patterns, to organize the world in terms of patterns. A major obstacle for me in the search for meaning in these long summers in Maine is that I've always thought that for something to have meaning, it has to be permanent, or at least last a very long time. And what's the point, I ask myself, of anything that's here today and gone tomorrow, like a meal or a letter or a pair of shoes? By contrast, people still discuss and perform King Lear hundreds of years after it was written. People still gaze in awe at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And I've been there. I'm sure many of you have as well. But I'm a materialist. And as a materialist, I know that nothing lasts. Even King Lear might be forgotten in 1,000 years. Or if 1,000 years isn't long enough for your personal idea of a long time, what about 10,000 years? 10,000 years is the blink of an eye to the cosmos. Everything that I see around me at this moment, the bench, my desk, the books on my bookshelf, the trees in my town, my children, and their children, all of that will be gone without a trace in 1,000 years. In fact, does anything we do on our modest planet, only one among billions of planets in our galaxy, which is only one among billions of galaxies in the observable universe, does any of that have meaning on a grand scale, on a cosmic scale? On the other hand, maybe my starting assumption that meaning requires permanence is erroneous, or perhaps meaning itself is an illusion. After all, why should I insist on meaning? Fish and squirrels get by quite well without it. These are the kinds of unsettling thoughts that run through my mind while I'm walking around on the island in the summer. And sometimes I pose to myself the following situation, which I'll call the Smart Ant Conundrum. So imagine a colony of highly intelligent ants. And suppose further that this ant colony lasts for 100 years. That's a very long time for an ant colony. So over the century, these brainy ants create a great civilization. They build advanced structures underground. They compose music. They create paintings and theater. They write books and record histories of their society. They develop science and they make theories about the cosmos, both inside the anthill and beyond. They have emotions and intimate relationships. And then one day, a flood comes and totally destroys the ant colony. Totally. There's nothing left. No ants, no ant books, no ant paintings, no remnants, nothing. Everything is completely destroyed. There's no trace left in the universe of this magnificent ant colony. So the question I ask myself, did the ant colony have any meaning? And now, after it's gone, with no record of its existence, does it have any meaning now? I squint my eyes and I try to see Professor Yalov's patterns. I think I see them in the small when I watch reflected sunlight flickering on my bedroom ceiling or hummingbirds hovering near my front porch. I think I see patterns and meaning in the moment, but not beyond. And maybe the moment is all there is. But for some reason, I and many of my fellow travelers are not satisfied with the moment. The now isn't enough. We want to go beyond the moment. We want to build systems and patterns and memories that connect moment to eternity. We want to be part of the infinite. So finally, I want to discuss some of these issues in a more personal and specific way. And that's in my personal attitude toward death. One can argue that many of our religious and spiritual beliefs are motivated by a knowledge of our own physical mortality. In fact, there was a wonderful book written in the 1970s called The Denial of Death, which some of you may have read, which argued that our entire civilization is a defense against our mortality. All material things are made of atoms and molecules, and those particles are part of the physical world. And according to the laws of science, all material is governed by laws. Immortality is not allowed by the laws. Disembodied existence is not allowed by the laws. Insubstantiality is not allowed by the laws. And I'm a materialist, but I also consider myself a spiritual person. So I'm what you might call a spiritual materialist. How does a spiritual materialist confront his or her own impending death? That's the question. That night I was lying in the boat in Maine, looking up at the stars. I felt a powerful connection to the cosmos. And I'd like to explore that connection a bit more as a spiritual materialist. In fact, all of us, and I'm sure that you know this being MIT grads, all of us are literally connected to the stars. All the atoms in our bodies, except for hydrogen and helium, were manufactured in the centers of stars. This is a picture of an exploding star. And when stars explode, we believe that they spew out the heavy elements that they have manufactured in their cores, elements heavier than hydrogen and helium, which are necessary for life, like carbon and oxygen. The stars explode, the massive stars, that is, one's bigger than about 10 times the mass of our sun, and they spew out these elements into space, these heavy atoms, then diffuse throughout the galaxy. Some of them then condense into nebula, solar nebula, and planetary systems, and eventually into planets. And if we could, so all of our atoms originated in stars, and that's a great connection between us. In other words, if I could trace each of my atoms backwards in time, my particular atoms go backwards in time to the formation of the solar system, to that gas drifting through space, I would find that my atoms were part of particular stars in the sky, my exact atoms. Now, instead of going backwards in time, let me go forwards in time, and I'm almost at the end of my talk. Let me go forwards in time to my death and beyond. The atoms in my body will remain only they will be scattered about. Those atoms will not know where they came from, but they will have been mine. Some of them will have been part of the memory of my mother dancing a bossa nova. Some will have been part of the memory of the vinegary smell of my first apartment. Some of them will be part of this hand, will have been part of this hand. Those atoms will be mine, even though they won't know that they came from me. And if I could label each of my atoms at this moment, imprint each with my social security number, and now remember, I'm going forward in time after my death instead of backwards in time to find my atoms in supernova stars. If I could label each of my atoms, imprint each with my social security number, someone could follow them for the next 1,000 years as they floated in air, mixed with the soil, became parts of particular plants and trees, dissolved in the oceans, and then floated up again in the air. And some of my atoms will undoubtedly become parts of other people, particular people. Some of my atoms will become parts of other lives, other memories. So we are literally connected to the stars, and we are literally connected to future generations of people, literally, with material atoms. And in this way, even in a material universe, we are connected to everything. And in this way, we achieve some kind of immortality. So I'll stop there. And I'll be happy to take questions.
Okay, that was great. Thank you very much. And I spent some time on sailing at night myself, and I can verify that. Yeah, it's being out on the water, absolute quiet, just the stars. It really is a magnificent experience. So I'd like to invite everyone to submit their questions in the Q&A box, and our another MIT Club volunteer, Mia, will read them out for Professor Lightman to answer, hopefully. All right, Mia?
Thank you for the introduction, Megan. And Professor Lightman, that was a very interesting talk. Thank you so much. I guess first things first, as our first question, do you think spirituality and science are similar in their quest for transcendence?
Yes, in a way. I think that that in science we're looking for the truths of the cosmos. We're looking for laws that are in some sense eternal. And when we find those laws, or we have some understanding of nature, that certainly is an understanding that goes beyond our individual selves, our individual egos, which is very much what happens in the transcendent experience. So I think definitely there's a similarity there.
Our next question is, Buddhists stress the importance of the present, the here, now. Do their views of space-time have any effect on your views of the math behind space-time?
Well, I think that the math of space-time is given by Einstein's theory of relativity, his special and general theories, which I imagine that most of the audience has studied in some form or another, maybe physics 801 or 802. But that deals with the physical world. and I think that the psychological experience of being in the world is a very, very different experience. It's the world of perception. Of course, the only thing that we know about in terms of being in the world is the way that our sensory perceptions are taken in and processed by the brain. The brain has its own sense of time. It's well known that our memory of the past is faulty, that we invent things that didn't happen, we forget things that did happen. So the psychological experience of time is quite different than the flow of time that's measured by rulers and clocks. And in fact, when Einstein began working on his theory of relativity, he had to put aside all of his psychological associations with time and ask, what do clocks in relative motion actually measure? And looked at the mechanics of measurement and the mechanics of clocks. So he sort of was willing, and all good scientists are able to do this, to reject, at least for a while, his sensory perception of the world, and instead go by logic and rationality.
That seems like a big jump to me.
A huge jump. And remember, he was only 26 years old. But maybe it takes a young person to reject sensory perception and the received wisdom of Isaac Newton, among other people, to start out on something new like that.
Very cool. A follow on to that is there an equation that dictates that we must stay in the present, the here and now?
No, I don't think so. But I certainly think that the here and now are hardwired into our sensory apparatus. So I don't think that there's any way that we can get around that.
Sounds fair to me. Our next question: have you written about you have written about infinity as applying to the very small as well as structures as large as the multiverse? Do you think that infinity applies to our human existence apart from our atomic structure, which you say is part of eternity?
Well, personally, I do not believe that there is life after death. That's my personal view. And so I think that when we die, our atoms disperse, our consciousness dissolves. And so I don't believe there's any infinity in time with regard to our existence, to our conscious existence. Our atoms, as I said at the end of my talk, could last for a very, very long time, but they don't have won't have the special arrangement that makes consciousness. I'm sorry, that's a very unromantic answer to the question.
Well, they are asking it to a physicist. Okay, so another one is, do you think that a perception of certainty is necessary for a spiritual experience?
That the assumption of certainty?
Do you think that a perception of certainty is necessary for a spiritual experience?
Definitely not. Definitely not. I think that there are many things in our human lives that are uncertain, that are filled with ambiguity. And there's a word in Hinduism. I think it's a Sanskrit word called a concept called darshan, D-A-R-S-H-A-N. And what it means is being open to the divine. And I think that the divine doesn't have to be God. It doesn't have to be, Buddha. It's just being open to the awe of the cosmos. And I think that there's a certain humility that's built into that concept, that when we open ourselves up to the outer world, there's sort of an admission that we don't know everything, that we're taking in things. And so that's, to me, that goes along with uncertainty. If you're sure of everything, if you know the answer to everything, you don't need to open yourself up to anything because you know it all.
Yeah, that makes sense. It sounds like it meshes very well with the scientific approach to the world. It's always searching for more answers. Another question that we've gotten is, how does religion, which is very earth-based, deal with the existence of life on other worlds?
Well, not all religious traditions are earth-based. It's true that the only phenomena, the only living things that we know are on Earth, but we certainly believe they're living things elsewhere in the universe. It would be extremely unlikely that life exists only on our one small planet, on the outskirts of an ordinary galaxy. So I don't think that that there's any fundamental mismatch or disagreement or disconnect between religious beliefs and the existence of a larger universe beyond planet Earth. So anyway, that's an answer. We could talk further about that, but we'll go on to the next question.
Okay. Next question. How much does meaning derive from a motivating impulse as opposed to a descriptive reality?
Oh, that's a great question. Meaning, to me, goes beyond a describing reality. We're not just looking at things and writing down what we see like a botanist in a big notebook. Meaning comes from organizing our observations and finding some larger pattern, some larger law that organizes all of the different detailed observations that we make. So there's certainly motivation behind that. Our desire to know, to understand, is more than just a desire to measure each insect and write it down in a book, the length and weight of each insect. It's to understand patterns. So I'm getting back to Professor Yalom's Gestalt ideas, I think.
Makes sense. I guess we're coming pretty close to the end of our time, so I want to say, is there anything that any parting thoughts you want to leave the group with, or any advice for those of us trying to better have a foot in both the scientific and spiritual worlds?
Well, I'll just say that I think that science and spirituality are not in conflict with each other in any way. I think it's possible to be a spiritual person and also be a scientific person. And I believe that that the people, I shouldn't say the people, but people who have been trying to create a battle or draw battle lines between science and spirituality, that they are doing us all a big disservice. They're both parts of being human. They're parts of ways of being in the world. That since recorded history, that we have been both experimentalists and we've been experiencers. That we try to understand the world in material terms, but we also try to express this centuries-old current of feeling of being part of something larger than ourselves. The paintings and the Cro-Magnon paintings in the prehistoric caves of France, you can look at those paintings and you can see that those people were trying to find meaning in a way that was larger than just their individual lives. So that openness to the world, that darshan, that receptiveness to the larger world, that attempt to express what it means to be alive, that is part of us, as well as our rationality and our logic and our mathematics. So all of those things are possible. They're all part of being human.
A wonderful sentiment to end this on. Thank you so much for your time.
Yes, I just want to say thank you again. Thank you so much. This was this was wonderful, and I just have a million thoughts in my own head about especially my background is in biology and pathology, and remember one of my favorite, and I love hearing stories about kind of watching people learn about inside of their own bodies for the first time. It's I go to the Body Worlds exhibit and I sit there and watch the live people, watch the reactions. So yes, this was great. We just had a couple of more of a comment than a question from our Q&A. One of our attendees, Mona Laternos, wonderful presentation. I never expected to meet a conquered transcendentalist in the tradition of Emerson and Thoreau in my own lifetime. So
thank you very much for that.
Yeah, it's it really is good to for ourselves spend time thinking about the interactions of science and faith and spirituality. So yes, that I'd just like to thank everyone for the great questions. There are a few that we couldn't get to. I'm sorry, we could go on all night, but we are coming to the end of our time. So I'll just say again, thank you again, Professor Lightman. Remind people the book is available at fine bookstores everywhere. Also look for the children's book, Ada and the Galaxies. The illustrations are not, of course, by Professor Lightman, but they're beautiful. And I hope to see many of you come back to many of our other club events. Get involved in some of our K through 12 programs, some of our social programs, and I hope to continue seeing people virtually until we can get back into meeting in real life. And just as a reminder, if you weren't aware, this session has been recorded and we will be putting it on our club's YouTube channel. We can also find archived content from some of our other speakers. So thank you very much, Professor Lightman. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you.
Good night, all.